Hey everyone, and welcome back for our seventh and final video in part one of Romans. I am Erin Warren here with my good friend Stacey Thacker. Good morning, Stacey.
Good morning, Erin. Hey, everybody. How are you doing today?
I hope everyone is doing well, and we are getting ready to dive into Romans chapter 7. Now, Romans chapter 7 has some confusing, maybe the right word. There's the first thing that we really want to dive into here is in the very beginning of chapter 7. Paul is using an example about divorce. Now, I want to preface this by saying this is not a passage on divorce. This is not Paul giving his opinion about divorce. This is Paul using an example like we saw in chapter 6, where he said, I'm putting this in human terms so that you can understand. And so he's using this law that they had in this day about divorce to show how we are released from sin.
Yeah, and about marriage and how we are released from the bonds of marriage in light of the bigger picture. The question had been, when can a woman obtain a certificate for divorce? I believe that's the law it's referring to.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's talking about how under certain circumstances, so a woman is married and her husband, they're divorced. She can't remarry as long as he's alive. But again, what Paul is trying to do is paint a picture. We are married to our sin. And until we die to our sin, or our sin dies because of our life in Christ, when we give our life to Christ, we are still going to be married to sin, no matter what we do. And so he's showing how, using this as an example to show how we die to sin, and now we have new life in Christ. Now we are free from that bondage that we can then marry in this sense, or be united with Christ and living life under him as opposed to under sin.
Yeah, and it's classic Paul using an example that his listeners, the people he was teaching, would have known. We've already talked about slavery, and now he's bringing marriage into the picture. He's trying to pull out examples of things they would know. Later in Scripture, he talks about sports, and he talks about farmers and all different things. Paul is always using examples that his readers and the people he was teaching would know. And so this is just Paul's way of saying, hey, let me just give you a real life example. When are you released from the law? Well, the death releases you from the law. And that's true in marriage. If a woman's husband dies, she's released from the marriage, but only when he dies is what he's saying in this particular. But that's not really the point.
Right, exactly.
The point is the law.
Yes. And that's
yes,
what he says in our fighting words for this week. In verse 6, he says, but now we are released from the law, having died to that which has held us captive, which is sin, so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. So he's saying, again, we're not under the written law anymore. Now we are under the grace of God.
I love that word, released. I think in the King James it says loosed. We're loosed, which means to be severed, separated, discharged.
Yes.
So like to be let go of and released. I think that's such a beautiful picture of that in that path. I love that word and the fighting words from this week. We're released from it. We're loosed from it because we died to that which has held us captive. So was the law bad? What do you think his people, the people who were listening to this letter, what do you think they were thinking when he brings up the law? Do you think the law was bad? Is the law evil?
I know. Well, and that's what he goes into in verse 7. Again, he's kind of listening to that silent objector. He's already thinking about how they might have questions about what he's saying. And so he poses yet another question. Paul loves questions in the book of Romans. And he says in chapter 7, what then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. I love that. By no means.
Yes.
By no means.
Yes.
Yet, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had said, do not covet, or you shall not covet. I love this part. Is really, I think a lot about my kids. When I think about this, I have 3 kids. They are 3, almost 6, and 8. And we often are trying to create peace in the battles that they have. And while my 8-year-old doesn't understand why my 3-year-old gets away with something that he doesn't, I have to explain to him that it's because, he's still learning. He has not learned the law, so to speak, about how we behave. And so his behavior and the way that we train him is different than our 8-year-old. And I have to remind him that when he was 3, we treated him that way. And we treated him the same way he sees. And that's really what Paul is saying. He's going, this law, this, if we didn't have something that told us what was right and wrong, we wouldn't know right and wrong. And so the law acts as a training aid. The law is in and of itself is neutral.
Yeah, I think I love the point that the law wasn't evil. And I actually looked up by that when he says, by no means, it means God forbid. I think Paul, like you said, had already anticipated that the Jewish believers were going to go, wait a minute. Were released from the law. The law was what they clung to, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what he was trying to say, no. I'm not saying the law is bad. I'm saying that the law, what the law did was it unveiled or pointed to their sin, that it exposed the sin for its true character. That's what the law did. It pointed to it. It was like, I've heard that people say that the law was like a tutor. It was like, it wasn't like the whole point of the law wasn't to try to keep it, because the point was that you can't.
Right.
The point that when you focus on the law to keep it, then you are held captive by it. Like it comes out as this almost like taskmaster. Like, oh, you think you can keep the law? You can't keep the law, but keep trying to keep it. Like it's this vicious cycle. Yeah. And I love that when he says that it reveals, it uncovers and it reveals our sin, is that as he goes through that explanation about sin, where he says, I gotta find the verse here, where he says, sin seized an opportunity through the commandment, that he actually takes sin and personifies it like as a person.
Yeah.
Because sin actually seized him. Like, and I don't think that is like akin to the devil made me do it. Don't, I'm not saying that. But the sin which within him that the law points out seized him.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And I think really he's kind of shifting this idea that it's not about obeying the letter of the law. It's now under grace in the spirit of the law. Because the law is still good. I mean, it's still not okay to covet. It's still not okay to murder. It's still not okay to have adultery or take the name of the Lord in vain. Those laws and commandments from God are still a guideline for how we should live. But now we live in the spirit and we live under grace and we live under freedom. And so now the law no longer determines whether or not we're righteous. It's God's covering over us that determines whether we're righteous.
Yeah, and I think that we had talked about that in a previous video about the sanctification process, about being transformed. And I feel like this is Paul saying, hey, I struggle too. Yeah. I love that he goes to his own personal life, that Paul's not afraid to be real with his readers. He's not saying, the law is bad, but he's coming into it, he's bringing it home. He uses the example of marriage and uses that example being set, like a way to be set free for the law that they would have done. And then he brings it personal. He's like, hey, listen, I war every day with my own personal sin, and sin seizes me and wrestles me, and I'm wretched, like I'm a wretched man. Like Paul hasn't arrived. I love that he is so aware and so willing to be real, because that's really what we connect with, right? Yeah. I mean, when we're honest with the things that we struggle with, I think that's really what we connect with people. I love that Paul isn't so he's not self-righteous, like, oh yeah, I got this figured out.
Like y'all do that. I don't. I mean,
I don't do that. Yeah.
I want to read it just because these are some of my favorite words that he writes. I almost laugh reading them. I'm going to read starting in verse 18 of chapter 7. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now, if I do is what I do, it's a tongue twister. Yeah. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but the sin that dwells in me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being. I love it. He's saying, listen, I know what I want to do, and I can relate with this. I know I don't want to fly off the handle and yell at my kids when for the 5th time I've asked them to put their shoes on that morning. But yet I find myself yelling at my kids and I'm doing the things that I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
But it's because we live, we've talked about this, between the already and the not yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know that we're already saved and that Satan is going to be defeated, but already, but not yet have we been completely, we're not in heaven, we're on earth. And so we're living in this messy world. And that's really what we're going to get into, in part 2 with chapter 8 is this, fallen world that we live in. And Paul is saying, like, listen, I know, like, it's a war. I love that you use that word because it's true. We struggle. And I think that's why we see so many verses in scripture, particularly in Hebrews, talking about how we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. Turn your mind to Jesus. Remember turn your mind to the things that you've learned so that you don't drift away. That one's Hebrews 2:1. That one's one of my favorites. Because if we do not continually turn our mind to remember the truth of God and what he has done in our lives, we very much can get caught up in the legalism and the sin that Paul is kind of talking about here.
Yeah, I think we all, as we're kind of glancing towards Romans 8, which I think a lot of people are really more familiar with, but we're not going to get there yet. I think we all wish we could just magically transport ourselves to Romans 8. But the truth is, I think where we live is kind of back and forth between 7 and 8, because we're going to get to those really encouraging words where we hear there's no condemnation for those in Christ.
Yeah.
That's there's nothing can separate us from the love of God. That preaches, right? That's what we want to get to. But there's this tension between 7 and 8 where we're like, like Paul says, he does things he doesn't want to do, and he doesn't do the things he wants to do. I mean, that covers all the sin that you do, and the sins that, of omission and commission, right? So Paul struggles with all of it. And we really want to be in 8, but the truth is we're really back and forth.
Right.
And just like you said, what we need to do is shift our focus so that we're focusing on who Christ is and what he did, so that we have a hope, a hope of maybe leaning more into 8. But we're still living in 7 because of the brokenness of our world and our sin that still is within us. And so I think there's a lot of freedom in that. I had heard a story about famed preacher, Canadian preacher who preached at Moody for about 14 years, Harry P. Ironside. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a famous pastor. He had like no particular seminary education, but he was one of the most famous pastors of all time. But he had a woman come to him one time in a counseling session, and she said, I want you to know that I don't struggle with sin anymore. And his comment to her was, she said, I stopped sinning. And he goes, well, what a pity. And she was like, why would that be bad? He goes, who's going to save you? Who's going to save you? And the whole point is, I think maybe possibly why we still struggle with sin, one tiny part of it is because we need Jesus. And part of that struggle is to continue to bring us into that throne room of grace, into that place of mercy, into that place where we stand positionally. But if we don't need him, what a pity.
Yeah.
That we would need him.
Yeah. It's kind of a lonely place because the rest of us really need him.
Poor you must be really, I just thought that was a really great comeback from a really famous preacher who, she probably thought, oh, he's going to compliment me.
Yes.
Pity. Like, such a pity. But I love that story. I thought that was so good. Yeah.
And I think, what's interesting, and we know that the truth is she does still sin because we all still sin because we're all still human and because we're still on this earth. And I really kind of, after reading this, the question that I felt God kind of prompting my heart is, am I distressed over my own sin? Am I waging that war in my own heart and in my own mind over how my sin is? And that was kind of a hard pill to swallow. Mm-hmm. When I mess up, do I feel that in my gut that I messed up?
Mm-hmm. Or how quick do you feel it?
Yeah.
And I know you feel it because we have those conversations, but I think really the true test of where we're fixing our eyes and if we're considering Christ on a continual basis is how quick we feel it. Like, is it going to take the first time, the first prick? Ooh, that's a sin issue. I need to confess and move on. And, Or is it going to get a little hard and going to take a little bit more of the Lord's attention to bring it to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, this was our big quote from the week. You can surrender to sin and struggle against God, or you can surrender to God and struggle against sin. Either way, you struggle, but only one way provides the power to stand up against the temptation to sin and the forgiveness to cover you when you sin.
So good. That's so good. That's such a great summary for this chapter. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, and what we saw in chapter 6, and remembering that when we surrender to sin and we say no to God, all we're doing is begetting more sin. But sin leads to more sin, and sin leads to death. And it sounds harsh, but I think that Paul needed to give them that wake-up call to say, listen, continuing in sin under the guise of, oh, he's going to forgive me because I have grace, that doesn't net you anything. That's putting investments in the wrong bank account. That's a bank account that just drains. But when you make an investment in your life and you surrender to God, yes, we're still going to struggle with sin. Yes, we're still going to make mistakes because we're not perfect, but God doesn't expect us to be. And when we feel that prick in our heart, when we feel the distress over our own sin, that's when we start to have this fertile soil for God to begin to change our hearts and change our minds, and for us to be a light for Christ in a dark and fallen world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, as you were saying that, I was thinking, there's kind of two places we can either go, oh, we'll just keep sinning because there's more grace. But then as we get going, I think the closer we walk with Christ, we're even more aware of the own wickedness that still remains within us, or we can just deny it and go, oh, well, we don't sin at all. And then that becomes an even bigger sin of pride, which sets us up for probably a bigger fall. I think in both cases, sin is winning. I think just going back to what you said about the war, I realized a lot of times that there's only two people that are aware of the war that I'm fighting, which is me and Jesus. It's there. And sometimes that's the only two people that really know that I'm struggling with fear, or I'm struggling with shame or worry. Only Jesus knows. Only Jesus knows. But I have to come to that battle line and decide, I'm afflicted and I'm miserable. And if I want to be set free from that, is I have to choose daily. Am I gonna surrender, like you said, to the sin and let it bury me? Or am I gonna surrender to God and let his life-giving power overwhelm me and draw me out of that place that's affliction and wretched, and breathe life into my soul and help me work through something that he wants to set me free from. I think that's how we begin that process of experience in real life the fruit of righteousness that he has promised us.
Oh, that's so good, Stacey. That's so good. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes this is probably the good girl in me, and this may be a whole nother discussion we could have sometime.
I love the good girl in you.
Sometimes those rules and the law feels a lot more comfortable than freedom.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I know for me, the idea of just really truly letting go and trusting the Lord's work in an area in my life. I should and have to and all those things, but sometimes I think about the Jewish believers and I think, oh, how hard it must have been in their heads to go, set free?
Set free? What?
Set free? What is that? And so sometimes I think we should a little too much. I know for me that is the case. And so just realizing that sometimes the law feels more comfortable is just understanding that as a Christian, as someone who's walked with the Lord for a while or really comes out of that place, we just have to set our minds with the idea that in the Spirit, there's freedom. Doesn't mean that the law isn't, like you said, isn't true. It just doesn't rule us. Our hearts are set in line with Christ, and he's the one that has the authority of our lives, not the law.
I think that's a great point. And I think that's why so many, I guess all except for Christianity, world religions are works based. It's because people want to know their progress. You know, when you work in a job and you get evaluated each year, you want to know how you're doing. And so you need something to measure yourself by. And it's really hard for us to release that sometimes and go, God doesn't use a measuring stick with us.
Yeah.
You know, he just covers us and he says, you don't have to work for this. This is my gift to you because I love you with a steadfast love. And no matter what you do, you're not going to make me love you more or less. I just love you because I love you. And we want in our human nature to go, no, 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 I need something to measure me by. Measure me by this. And he's going, no, I've got grace. I measured you by grace. And so you're covered and it's good. I want to read. I love too, when you study the Bible and you start to see different authors with the same themes and they say the same thing. In 1 Peter 2, verse 16, Peter writes, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover up for evil, but living as servants of God. I loved, you know, it's the same idea. It's kind of like chapter 7, all in 6, all in one sentence. This idea that, you know, we're not using our grace as an excuse to cover up evil, but that we are saying, no, we're not going to be controlled by our sin nature anymore. We're going to live under the grace and the freedom that God has given us.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
I like that. I like it when Peter and Paul agree.
I know. It's so nice.
It's so nice.
Oh.
It makes for a nice packaged ending.
Yes, it does. It does. And our fighting words this week were Romans 7:6. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in a new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. So again, remembering when you are tempted to try to measure yourself by the law, I want you to remember that you are not under the control of the written code anymore, but that you are serving in a new way of the Spirit.
Praise God.
And Stacey, we made it all the way through part 1.
Part 1 is finished. We should just like happy dance. Woo! Well done.
Yes.
Well done.
Thank you all so much for joining us through this first 7 weeks. We are going to take a couple weeks off, and because it's always good. This has been a lot. There's a lot to learn in Romans 1 through 7. And like we've said many times, we actually could probably spend a whole couple years studying the book of Romans and still be learning something new each time we open it. And it's always nice to get to a point, like a finish line, where we can just pause and we spend the next couple weeks kind of going back over what we've learned. And so that's what we want to do. We're going to do one more video for part 1, and we're going to talk about kind of do that with you and kind of go back and some of the key points that have stood out to Stacey and have stood out to me. And then the first week of April is when we will officially kick off part 2, but you can do it at your own pace whenever it suits you. And we're going to do part 2 will be Romans 8 through Romans 12.
It's going to be a good study.
Romans 8.
Oh, let's get excited about that one too.
I know. Well, and it's so big. Actually, Romans 8 is divided into 3 different weeks because there's just so much in Romans 8. Yeah. So much. We could probably do a lecture just in Romans 8.
Well, and Romans 8 really goes back. It's gonna be a great start for the new part 2, because it really goes back, and then it brings it. Oh, it's gonna be good.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. So we'll see you back next week for a little bit of kind of going back over. So spend this time this week, go back over your notes and really ask God to instill in you some of the truths that he has shown you as we have walked these 7 weeks together.
It's going to be great. Thanks, Erin.
Right. Thank you. And I hope that each of you has a wonderful day.
Bye, guys.